But what I'm interested in hearing about now is what are some of the upcoming features on the roadmap? You mentioned unstructured data, which I could see being a real game changer, but what else is on the roadmap?
Exactly. So just for this one, right? I mean, you might have gotten your requirements not in a nice spreadsheet, but basically in some old document in a PDF. Maybe it's a scan of a PDF of a scan. This kind of stuff that you usually are confronted with. And today you still have the work of having to basically manually go after this. And we're going to make it easier to bring for you to bring these kind of requirements in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Altium On Track podcast. I'm your host, Zach Peterson. Today, we're talking with Marco Witzmann, head of Requirements Portal at Altium. We're going to learn a bit more about the Requirements Portal, especially after the recent release of Altium Develop. And I'm very excited to learn more about the Requirements Portal and how it works within the new Altium Develop. Marco, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Zach.
We have not had you on the podcast before. Before we start talking about the requirements portal, if you could just give us a brief introduction to yourself and how you got started in the industry.
Sure. So I'm a satellite engineer by training. So I used to work in the aerospace industry. I worked on a spacecraft that was a geostationary satellite for 3.5 years as a satellite systems engineer. And at my job, one of the things that I noticed was, somehow we still have 20,000 official documents and 300,000 unofficial documents. And that was basically 7 years before launching the spacecraft. So I thought there must be a better way to do engineering. And when I found out that this was not my company or my project being like badly organized, but basically that the industry was lacking good ways of organizing the requirements and what they were supposed to build and how that related to their design, I decided to create a company called ValleySpace. And that company basically built a requirements and systems engineering tool that allows users of building complex systems or smart products to basically collaborate all in one place. And that's how I entered the industry. And after, I would say, 8 to 9 years of doing that, we started partnering first with Altium and then later actually got end of 23 acquired by Altium. And this is how basically what used to be the ValleySpace product is now the requirements portal on the Altium Develop platform.
Yeah, this is interesting because you mentioned a very large number of documents that were relevant to the product that you're working on. And, you working in aerospace, I've also worked in aerospace. I know quite a few people who also work in aerospace, and that seems to be a really common problem. The documents seem to range, everything from the product specification for what you're working on, the specification for related products, but they then affect what you're working on. Then there's probably like industry or government standards documents and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it extends to test reports, and there's the places where you try to start having different versions of these documents. You start to try to make matrices, how the requirements relate to the design and the other way around, and all of these kind of things, exactly. And they basically stack up. And of course, I mean, mine was a very big satellite program, but I think every engineer who has ever worked on a project is very familiar with this feeling of, what did we agree on? And wasn't there a requirement somewhere that I should have taken into account? And was that version 2B or 2C that we should, right? That kind of thing, I think, is something that everyone has experienced. And I think that was also the key moment that made that light bulb go on in my head, where I said, okay, if that's so common and we live in this age in which software can really help you accelerate all the things that you do, well, there should probably be a system that allows you to do that in a better way.
Sure. So with the requirements tool that you built, what exactly does it do? Does it distill large amounts of data into a small number of requirements? Does it let users define their own requirements? Give us kind of that high level overview.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, every time that you want to build anything, you probably have requirements, right? Sometimes don't have them in a formal way, but maybe their boss sent them an email, hey, this is what I want you to do, right? That's also requirements. Or your customer basically told you in a meeting and you took some notes. But sometimes you actually have formal requirements. Maybe you have some standards. If you work in an industry that is very formal, like medical or something, you might have a lot of standards. So you have all these kind of documents, right? And the first thing that you want to do is you basically want to have them all in one place, right? You don't want to wonder what's the version of this, which requirement was there, which standard is applicable. So having all of them in one place, version control all of these. So make sure that every change to a requirement that you have is version controlled. If you have discussions around the requirement, you want to be able to go back and see, oh, this is how it changed over time, right? That's already where spreadsheets fall down completely, right? I mean, and that's what most people do today. They put this on spreadsheets and maybe in a Jira ticket or something like this. So what you want is basically that full traceability. And then what you often do is if you have a more complex product, let's say you have a multi-board project, then you have like these high level requirements. You're trying to break them down into lower level requirements, right? You're trying to like figure out, okay, where am I actually going to solve this? Where am I going to solve this? And then you come to the next point. You're trying to like figure out which components are you going to use. And again, you should go back to the requirements. What do I actually need? And so now you have a PCB designer and he's in front of like Altium designer maybe. And he's wondering, well, which were the requirements that are actually applicable, and starts looking at the document and so on. So in what our software does is bring the requirements basically in, allow you to have them in context, allow you to break them down, allow you to have the history of them, and then basically go all the way up. If you know the V cycle of engineering, where you start with high level requirements, you break them down into lower level, and then you start verifying them, basically going up the V again. That's basically what we allow people to do. So then to basically write down test procedures, test steps, and then to say, oh, actually, this requirement we tested here, this requirement is fine here, so that you have a lot of confidence when you, in the end, like deliver your design or deliver your product to say, yes, I'm pretty sure this actually fulfills all the requirements that we had and they were complete. So you check for completeness and so on. And basically, the requirements portal gives you all these small tools that you need to do that, to collaborate on them, and to basically support you in this entire process.
So this is not a new tool, as you mentioned earlier. I think you said it was founded in, I believe, 2023 or acquired by Altium in 2023. And it's now getting to the end of 2025. So I'm sure there's been some changes since the tool was first released for use by customers and then integrated into Altium. And now that we've got the new Altium Develop out that users can access, I'm sure there have been some further changes. So if you could give us kind of a high level overview of how the platform has evolved over time.
Yeah, so I think one of the most exciting pieces of it is really that the requirements portal has become this integral part of the Altium Develop platform, or Altium Develop, Altium Agile, both. So that you basically, if you're a user and you're actually already working in this environment, it's not like an add-on that you have to get somewhere. There's no other URLs that you have to go to. There's no other, like it fits into what you're doing. So basically this piece that and I'm going to show this maybe later, that it's so easy to sign up and like try to get started and then immediately like go into the portal, start using these things. So that seamless experience is basically one of the key things that we've been working on. And then making sure that this kind of relationship between your requirements and your electronics actually works out well, that these things are connected. And then there's obviously also more interesting things coming up for later, but that has been what we've been working on over the last probably a few years.
So what are the benefits for some of the companies that tend to create their own specifications documents? Yeah. And, I immediately kind of think, okay, these are larger companies, but, I think if you're like a freelance designer or maybe a smaller firm, you probably also get handed one of these specifications documents and, you're just trying to figure out how to put this into a board, and you probably control F your way through a large portion of that document.
Yeah, and I think, there's basically these different use cases, right? For some, it's really, if you have a customer and that customer might come from automotive or from somewhere, and he really gives you this huge document, right? So the first thing for them is like being able to really be sure that you can prove that you have done everything, that you linked everything and so on in a very easy way, right? So you don't want to have this overall overhead, oh, how am I going to show this? People ask you, hey, can you give me a compliance matrix? And you're saying like, oh, I don't even know what to do here, right? So we basically help people do that. But then also, even if you're like working for yourself, if you're like a company that doesn't have these kind of customers, you're just working directly with your customers, what you still want is you want to have, like, keep track. You built the first version of your product and now you're evolving your product, for example, right? Like, how did these requirements change? What do you need to change? And then oh, which design choices did we take because of that? So if you want to know, oh, if I want to create these kind of improved performances, do I really need like a dedicated different tool, different like I don't know CPU, or do I need something else that I need to like change in my design? Is the sensor accuracy still fine? And if you have all these traceabilities, these are all answers that you can get very quickly. So it's basically that feeling of uh, having all the traces, knowing where everything went, and then being able to do change management very quickly, right? Maybe a supplier, like maybe in BOM portal, you get a notice and it says like, oh, this chip's not available anymore, right? Like you better know why you had this chip in the first place. If you do know, it's very easy to take a decision and say like, oh, I'm going to replace it with that one. But if you start from scratch and you wonder, well, why was that decision taken 4 years ago? You're gonna like order the new one and then find out. And I think that's the ultimate benefit is this. We're basically preventing people from doing rework, which is very expensive and very annoying, right? And we're making sure that people can actually innovate faster. It's basically quicker iteration cycles, getting your product out of the door quicker, and then with higher confidence that the design works the first time.
You brought up something interesting here, which was explaining why something in a design was done in the first place, or at least being able to infer it from looking at the requirement. I think that's really useful for like product lifecycle because especially like if the original designer maybe leaves the company, right? Or they get promoted or they move to a different team or whatever, right? Then you've got someone new coming in and now they have to learn everything about that design. And if you just hand them that, 200-page specifications document, I mean, no one wants to read that, right? But if you have everything compiled into this nice list in the requirements portal referencing specific objects in the tool, that actually makes that onboarding of that new person a lot easier.
Absolutely. And I think there's always, even if you have the same people, right, there's always two views on it, right? So on the one hand, you have like the project manager or the engineering leader or something, and he looks at the requirements. He's like, did we take care of all of them, right? So where did all of this go, right? Into which PCB was it, and which exact part did we select for this? So being able to trace this. And there's the other view from the bottom up where it's like, okay, I'm supposed to build this, but can you please tell me like what am I exactly supposed to build against, right? What are all the requirements that I should be taking into account? That standard too, this version of this standard, right? So all of these kind of things you also want to have in hand. So I think more than just a traceability tool over long times, it is also a communication tool basically for the day to day.
Yeah, I can see it being used to address that mind reading problem that engineers, especially new engineers, need to have because I mean I've come on to projects that are reasonably complex. It's a product that has maybe several boards, and you come into this project and you're kind of given minimal guidance, right? They hand you some design files, and you're just kind of wondering, okay, what am I supposed to do? Oh, well, it's in the spec document. And then you have to read through this 200-page document to try and figure out where things are at, what you need to do, and so on.
And I think that's also one of the important parts, right? It needs to be something that is low level accessible to everyone, right? Like, and I think if people sometimes hear requirements management system, they're thinking of these systems that were built in the 80s and that you need to install on your desktop. And then you'll have like, I don't know, I went at least through a 1 week training course just to know which buttons to push basically to get my requirements into a system. And I mean, these times have long gone, right? We now have systems that are very intuitive that you can use right out of the box. And that maybe even have like AI sometimes that can help you do things. So for example, Requirements Portal, if you're not sure how to write a good requirement, can help you improve your requirements, right? And so making sure that you write a good requirement because people know that if they write a bad requirement, you're likely going to get a bad product. But these things used to be, oh, I need to get a very seasoned system engineer to help me to basically review my things. And by now, that's just a few clicks away. So I think that's the kind of things that you get right out of the box from a tool that is now at your fingertips inside your normal tool chain. And I think that's what's exciting for any person working on a smart product today.
Obviously, you're the head of this of the requirements portal at Altium. So I'm sure you have some insight into how different types of customers are using it, right? Whether they're a large company with dozens of engineers, or whether they're maybe a small contract design firm, maybe they've just got a few people, and probably everything in between. So how are you seeing it being used by those different groups of people?
Big companies really go all the way when it comes to complexity, right? I mean, you might have not just one product, you might have product lines, and then these product lines might have different versions of each other and so on. And you maybe for example, you'll have a certain value that came out of a specific simulation that you want to reach, right? And then how do you go to that value, right? And that's why we can go all the way. We understand units, we can calculate things for you with formulas in there and so on. So there's very advanced functionalities that allow you basically to do these kind of use cases, use the same value in different requirements over and over again, so that when you change them, they just change once, things like that. So that's basically, you have a lot of users, they really organize all of their projects. You can even link things cross project and so on. That's one way. And then when we have small companies, it's really just, okay, instead of having that spreadsheet, instead of having that Google Doc, right? Let's just import those things in, have them here, link the things there, and then it just becomes part of your like normal day to day. So even have to think about it, right? And then you come to the point, either it's still your job to do verification and to make sure that it works. So then you can just continue. So often people just start with something simple, bring requirements in, and then over time they discover, oh, now we have to think about how we're going to test this, right? And oh, instead of starting a new document, writing new test procedures and so on, you just do it there. And then once you verify it, it actually verifies the requirements. You get all these things for free, basically, all these verification documents and so on. You just export them right out of the box.
You brought up the complexity uh, that large companies deal with, right? It's a product line, or maybe it's a single product, but it has a lot of PCBs, and then there's versions involved in everything. Um, how do you get requirements to kind of interrelate to each other across products that have some sort of connection between them, right? Like I'm thinking like a modular product, right? This is actually something that I've seen in satellites, which I'm sure you're aware of, right? They kind of develop these modules individually, and then they hook together. But of course, performance on one module will drive a requirement on a different module.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of wondering, how do you trace those two things together?
Yeah. So one thing that we have is clear traceability. So there's parent-child relationships where you can basically see that if one subsystem has basically impacts on other subsystems, you can basically see and trace that. You can have standards and make them applicable to multiple components. So you can say, well, that standard applies to all of these electronics components, but then that other standard only applies here because maybe that product line will only be sold in the US, and there's a different kind of standard that applies there than the European version, which needs to have like different performances. And then you can basically bring these kind of things together. So instead of looking at a product and being like, okay, looking at it just from the perspective of the product, you start looking at, okay, what is all the things applicable? Where did each of these requirements come from? And that's where you get these kind of traceabilities, basically. And then reuse is the other part, right? So if you have properties that need to be reused, let's say you have two different systems, and in the end, they're connected through a bus, and they need to have certain properties that are basically set up the right way in both sides of the bus, right? Then what you want is you want basically that same information to happen in both requirements. You don't want to go into one requirement, change it, and not be aware that another one changes. So what we have is we have basically parameters or values, we call it parametric requirements, which allow you that these kind of values change on the one side and then also change on the other side. And the last piece of it is also a process question, right? You always want to be aware that something changed. So what we have is capabilities where you can, for example, subscribe to changes. You want to be notified when something changes. And that's basically how you find out, oh, okay, something has changed here, and then maybe by some other person. And that's how you find out, instead of you having to go after people and be like, oh, what has happened since I went on holiday? You just read the notifications and you see what impacts you, basically.
Yeah, that change management is really difficult, especially when you get to these larger teams, because someone may change something and they don't even know who to email about it, right? I mean, and then if I don't ask about it, or I don't ask somebody who knows, I may never find out about it. And then all of a sudden, when we're testing, suddenly worlds collide, and somebody didn't tell somebody else that they changed a voltage or changed a pin out or whatever the
Exactly.
case may be.
I
Yeah.
mean, I've been definitely guilty in the past of writing VBS scripts for Excel that store the history of the Excel file into a second Excel file. And the reason why I would do these very weird workarounds is just because that's so necessary. You need to know what's going on. You need to find out when something changes. And the last way you want to do that is basically by looking through a big amount of, I don't know, Google Drive or SharePoint or something, and just sort by date and then find out who was the last modifier of this file. I mean, you can do it. People build complex stuff today, but we've met so many people over the years that basically said, well, next project, I really want to do it right. Next project, let's have one kind of problem less, basically. And that's when they get started, to just, so you don't have to do it like for everything that you've done before or something like this. Just pick the next thing that comes up and do it right. And that's how easy it is, basically.
So one other area where I think this kind of system where you have the requirements very clearly specified and accessible within the design is when you have to do a design review. And that could be like a live walkthrough with a client, or it's the type of design review where you hand it off to someone else on the team or someone else in your company, and they're doing like a peer review. Are you seeing the requirements being used in that way?
Yes. So basically, I mean, there are things also on the pipeline on our side to basically make this even more structured. Let's say it like this, right? So there's basically review capabilities that we're looking at. Um, but what we find often is either these people are inside your own parameter, right? So that basically means it's your colleague, it's your boss, or something like this. The easiest way is to do a review inside a tool. Why? Because what you want is you want the traceability, right? I want to see a requirement be where did that come from, and then just click and go there, right? I don't want to have like a very rigid kind of process or something like this where I'm like, oh, I'm only allowed to look at this document now, and then you basically have to look up the other things. You want to do that dynamically and then post your comments dynamically. So it's a bit going away from this waterfall idea that we all have. I mean, in software now, nobody does that this way, right? Like you do quick commits, and then people do like a review, and then it gets improved and so on. So these cycles are very quick, and basically doing that in the tool allows you to be very quick too. And then if your reviewers are outside, let's say it's your customer or it's something like that, then usually what you have to do is you have to prepare these documents, right? You have to like write a document and get all the things in, and you took the wrong version and sent them the wrong version, then they commented on an old one. So in the requirements portal, either you give people access also to like see the things in situ, and if you have a good trusting relationship with them and do that. But what is also something that happens very often is you just generate documents basically inside the requirements portal. With a single click, you generate a document, you send it out, and you can be sure that it's up to date. It took you like 10 seconds to basically generate that document instead of having to go through all of these places, compile things, and so on. So as long as generation of these assets is very quick, then it doesn't matter too much that the other person wants it in a spreadsheet or wants it in a document, because that's not the real problem. The problem usually is that you have to assemble all of this from your original data.
So we've talked about quite a bit, and what I'm really interested in seeing is some kind of a demo. So I'm hoping you can go ahead and show us something interesting.
All right, so it's actually extremely easy, right, to get started. What you do is you go to the altium.com develop website and you click get started, and that's basically what will bring you to create your own Altium develop workspace. And once you're in the workspace, so I'll just skip that step for now, but basically once you're in the workspace, you'll see this, and basically now you're inside Altium develop, and you'll have the design portal that you might be very familiar with if you had Altium 365 in the past, Altium Designer, of course. But if you scroll down, you'll directly see the requirements portal over here, right? So it's right there. It's as easy as opening it basically up from here. And basically, we're loading the requirements portal in the browser. It basically, if you do it the first time, it will ask you to basically request it, and it will be a few minutes later. It will be available. And then once you're in, we're already looking at an example, which is in this case it's a drone example, right? So you'll have a drone and you'll have all of these kind of requirements. So it goes from very high level mission requirements, right? So maybe if you build an entire drone, there's very high level requirements, but then it goes all the way down to like detailed requirements on the FMU, for example, and so on, right? And so let's just get started. Like imagine that you are working on this drone and for now you're interested in bringing in your other requirements. Maybe you have like your IMU requirements, you have them actually in a spreadsheet, right? So let's show you how easy that is. So basically, if you're on this one, if you're not sure how to write good requirements and you don't have them available, you can just describe in words what you're trying to build, and it basically will write like first requirements for you. But in this case, let's just go ahead and import requirements. We'll just say that we import those requirements to the IMU. Go ahead. Then I'll just take the IMU requirements. I'll drop that file in here. We'll go from there, and you'll see already, okay, it found identifier, text, and parent requirements, so that might be related to those. You click import, and that's basically how you get the requirements in. For now, basically our importer can handle structured Excel files, but in the future we might even we're bringing out an importer this year that will allow you to also import like PDF files and other things that are more unstructured. So same way as you have these requirements in here, you might have your, as I said, company standard, for example, that is in here, right? So you can see, oh, this is my company standard, and you can see, well, which kind of systems is it applicable to? So we said that's applicable to the FMU and it's applicable to the power distribution board, right? So you can basically make all of these decisions of what should these requirements be applicable to. You'll have the actual requirements of the FMU and so on and so forth. So you have all of this basically available. For each requirement, you'll have the entire history of how it was done, etc. Now, one of the things that I mentioned before is that parametric requirements, right? So what you'll see is that we actually found out that there's certain values in these that are not stored as text, but they're stored as parameters. So if I double click here to change it, you will see there's actually a variable in here, right? So that value, 20 kilometers, is actually a variable. And the reason why this is really interesting is because if I go to this requirement, right, so you'll see the text version of the requirement, but you'll actually also see in the properties that this is an actual value, right? We know that maximum flight distance is 20 kilometers. And the reason why this is interesting is, let's say that maybe you later need to actually work with the Americans and need to put miles out of it. Now, this requirement will be basically, and that's where the calculation engine comes in, it will recalculate behind the scenes what that means in miles. And if you go back to your requirement and actually like look at the requirement, it will actually state the whole thing in miles now. And the reason for this is the requirement hasn't changed in that sense, right? Like the requirement's still the same, but since these are parameterized requirements, we can do so much more with these kind of values. We can reuse that same distance in another place if we want to make a calculation and find out what we need to do about the drone and so on. So these are basically all parts that come from this ability to parameterize requirements. But now, let's say you have now your requirements here for your FMU in this case, for example. There's a lot of interesting information. And you're basically wanting now to design this, right? So here we're in the view of, I would say, the project manager, the requirements manager, maybe it's the engineering lead, maybe it's the project lead. And now that person basically hands over things to the PCB designer. And let's look at the other side of things, basically. And this means if you're now in the design, if we're now back into Altium Develop, right, in the platform, that's the beauty of having everything in one platform. I go to the design portal, and now from a design portal view, I'm basically now looking at it with the eyes of an actual designer, right? And I might have here the FMU already. So let me open up the FMU project. And in the FMU project, all the things that you're very familiar with, obviously, right? There's the PCB view, the 3D view, etc., etc. And now if we look, for example, at the CPU, right? And we're trying to find out a bit more on this view. That's where here there's this very small symbol and it actually says requirements. And this is where the magic happens. If you basically open it up here, you will find all of the requirements that are actually applicable to this FMU, right? And here is where it gets interesting. So if you say, for example, This should use an ARM Cortex M4 above, right? You can just place this requirement. In this case, we're placing it here. And this basically creates the full traceability. So we now know that that requirement basically is fulfilled by this specific CPU here, right? If we want to figure out which other requirements exist here for the processor, we can just look for processor. We'll find, for example, that it needs to ensure failover within 100 milliseconds. Same thing, I'm going to place it here. And then basically say need to take this into account during part selection, right? Whatever. So basically, there's the ability to link these things here. There's the ability to link it also on the bill of materials, on other places, right? So you can see that these kind of requirements happen in all these places. And that's where, if you're designing, right, the same view is available in Altium Designer, same sidebar basically. So from the view here, I can always know which ones are the requirements that I should be taking into account, and I can link them so that I have the full traceability from the text all the way to the requirement, from the requirement text all the way to the actual design.
So this is there's a couple of things I noticed here, and maybe you can comment on this. Right, when you were in the original requirements portal, right, there were specific operational things about specific components that obviously you can go in and place them onto a component in the CP or in the schematics as you've just done. But let's say I have my schematics ready to go, and there's a reference designator that's already been assigned. Can I just write the reference designator into the requirement, and will it auto tag?
So the tagging basically needs to happen in this kind of visual way in here, and so it happens on that part. You will later see the design references also appear in this place, so you can see them back here. But yeah, it's not about an ID that you just point in, but it's basically through this place mechanism that you basically place them wherever they belong.
I see, and I suppose there's probably multiple components that can play into it, so maybe it's not always fair to just write a reference designator. The other thing that's interesting here is you have an option to place a task directly from the requirement. So this is interesting, right? Because now you're linking the task to the requirement to the design object.
Exactly, right? Like you can assign basically a task to someone and say like, hey, Alchaos, right? Like implement this still. And then you can assign it to that person, right? And this is basically where it goes into the platform task management. You'll be able to like have that task and continue to track it. So that's when you talked about the review part also before. That's basically how you would also do it, right? You would make sure that everything that is in here has actually been linked. And if it has been linked, then if there's something that you find that is like not okay or still needs work, you can basically just go ahead and comment it either here or assign it as a task.
Well, the other thing I'm noticing here, right, and you can actually see it in this view, right, in CES-003, right, it says all components shall be derated, right? So this applies to all components.
Yes.
So, how do you work that into a design review workflow when someone is looking through the design document itself?
So the way we're doing this is basically, let me show you one piece of it. Basically, the whole verification of these parts is something that you'll have to plan the verification at some point, right? If you want to verify, usually what you do is you decide how you're going to verify these things, right? Some might be by a review, but some things might be by test and so on. So what you have in here is you decide basically these methods, right? So you'll decide, is this a hardware test? Is this a software test? What are you going to do about it, right? So you have different verification methods. And let's say, for example, there's this one requirement which is around dual processor redundancy, right? And it basically says, well, we want to do this in a hardware test. And you can actually find that this is dedicated in an end-to-end flight test, right? This is basically where it's going to be done. So the interesting thing is, since I can also manage the entire verification in here, you'll basically see there's the flight test, and it will basically say there's a procedure. How do you go about it, right? And there's basically different steps that you're going to do. And then in this case, for example, there's a failover that's being triggered, and that's where this specific requirement is being verified. The same thing you can basically do for reviews, right? You can basically say, okay, there's a critical design review, and basically, I mean, the procedure is quite simplistic, right? You'll have a data package and you'll look through it, and there's a review, and then you can say, okay, this, for example, happens through bomb review, and this is where you would expect that these kind of requirements are then linked, and in this case, yeah, CES 4004, it's basically linked here and tells you, okay, once you come to this step, this is what you're supposed to do. Like look for these specific things. And then once the interesting thing is once you do the verification in here, then back at the verification status here, you'll actually see what is verified already. So you'll start seeing basically here's the verification status is right now it's not verified, right? But this is where you will start seeing the overall verification status, and I mean, and that's where you can then dive further into it, like which verification status do you have on the verification matrix. You can basically see which requirement are you verifying where. So you'll see the end-to-end test and the critical design review, and you're going to be able to see where each of these requirements is being verified. So this one is during the design review, this one is during the test, right? So you can see, oh, this one we haven't decided yet, right? So we need to decide where this is being done. For example, FMU should do the control loops here. Well, probably that should be a test, right? It should not just be a review, right? So it's as easy as deciding, yes, that should be here, and then you can basically assign this to this kind of matrix. Make sure that you have completeness, right? And then you can even on the inside see, well, how many of your requirements have been verified already, how many have been assigned or not assigned. So you're going to be able to get these kind of insights, see these kind of things. And then once you're done, right, once you say like, okay, now I have all the information from my requirements, right? Either the requirements are ready or the verification is ready. You can always go ahead and export this as a document. And then you can basically say what I want is I want this to look as a verification matrix. You export the document, and that's basically where you're getting a Word document that will have all of these kind of information for you, and it will be downloaded. So that's basically how you close the loop. So you decide where you're going to verify things, and then the proof of all of these things, you're just exporting it. And then basically you can hand this over to anyone who you need to prove the completeness to.
Yeah, so this is gets back to something I mentioned earlier, which is a part of the overall product life cycle, right? Because now you're able to define requirements that are applicable once the design is actually done and fabricated, and now it's ready for testing. Because there's a whole bunch of stuff in here for test, and that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, that should be attached to the design somehow, right? I think normally it would probably just be added as some document in the PLM, and then the people who are actually working on the design might probably never see that. But now here, if they're like, let's say we're doing revision B of this product, now they can actually see what the test results were right there with all the other functional requirements.
Exactly. And so you'll know, for example, right, maybe your test actually showed that you can do it much faster, right? Maybe your results showed that there's actually still some memory left. So you can go back to this question when you basically design your next version. But it basically also, whenever something fails, let's say you actually want to know, okay, I'm really interested in this FMU requirement 9, right? Like we're not able to do the follower in 100 milliseconds. We're doing it in 120, right? We found out that just doesn't work fast enough, right? So now I'm curious, like, where does this actually come from? And that's where it gets very interesting. You just click on the connections and you're going to be able to see like, okay, actually, these are the kind of requirements that were driving this. So you now can have a decision and say like, oh, since this requirement was derived from these kind of parts, and it just said, oh, all of these requirements just say that we need to be able to land the drone safely within 2 seconds. Maybe if I can prove that I can still do that, then the 120 millisecond failover rate time is still fine, right? And that's the kind of trade-off in real life. Your system never works from the get-go. It never will be all perfectly to spec. And it's not that what is the problem. The problem is that you usually have a very hard time assessing, is that a problem, right? If I only had the document and didn't know where it come from, then I would never be able to take a decision of something needs to be modified or not. I'm probably doing rework that is completely unnecessary. And here you keep the entire history, basically. If one of these requirements came directly from your customer or from the, I don't know, international standard that you need to fulfill, and it would say it's 100 milliseconds, well, then you do have to actually fulfill this. In this case, you see, oh, it actually comes from our system requirements. Well, that's something we can deal with basically one by one. So that's the benefit of this traceability across the different levels. Where did the requirement actually come from?
Yeah, it helps answer that really fundamental engineering question. Why are we doing this?
Exactly. Which ultimately is the first question you should ask whenever you're asked to change something, right? Like, I think too often as engineers, we all jump into this, okay, let's quickly do something, let's quickly change something. But in reality, you probably should ask yourself earlier, like, why are we even here? And isn't there a better path basically to it?
Well, this is all really cool. I can see such a huge amount of productivity that can be gained by compiling this all in one location and having it all kind of integrate together like this. But what I'm interested in hearing about now is, what are some of the upcoming features on the roadmap? You mentioned unstructured data, which I could see being a real game changer, but what else is on the roadmap?
Exactly. So just for this one, right? I mean, you might have gotten your requirements not in a nice spreadsheet, but basically in some old document in a PDF. Maybe it's a scan of a PDF of a scan. This kind of stuff that you usually are confronted with. And today you still have the work of having to basically manually go after this. And we're going to make it easier for you to bring these kind of requirements in. Um, Another thing that we're working on is basically connecting the commenting and tasking systems even better with the portal, right? So that if you do a comment, whether you do it on the PCB itself, or if you do it in the portal, or if you do it in another place, it all shows up in the same place and basically is one coherent experience. Also very interesting when it comes to this verification part, we're working on making sure that it is a process that guides people towards verification, because also for verification there's different levels. Some people will just say on a very simplistic level, I'm going to test this, I'm going to review this, right? And we want to make sure that people are able to do it in this very simple way. But we also want to allow people to go all the way where they say, well, actually we have 7 different kinds of tests, they all have 20 different kind of steps. We're going to have to run the tests and rerun them once on that board and once on that board. And now we want to make sure that we can still prove for every requirement where it was verified, in which run, by which person, and so on. So what we're doing is we're basically improving the verification module in a way that allows you to go from the very simplest of cases all the way to the most complex of cases. We're making sure that the export capabilities get better, so that once you have, you can already upload templates yourself today, but we want to make sure that the default templates are better when you get these things out there, right? And so we do have a whole bunch of these kind of things on our pipeline. We're really excited to also learn from more and more people. Now that Altium Develop is live, we expect that a lot of more people will come that we haven't spoken to before, that basically have new kinds of experience, new kind of use cases. So we're always interested in seeing how people use it in this context and what kind of feedback they have, to also shape how the requirements portal will work and look like in the future.
Well, as all this stuff rolls out, I'm definitely interested to see it. I'm sure our viewers are very interested to see it. So we would love to have you or someone else from your team come back on and discuss all this in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being here, Marco.
Thank you, Zach, for having me.
To everyone that's out there listening, we've been talking with Marco Witzmann, head of Requirements Portal at Altium. If you're interested in learning about the Requirements Portal, head over to altium.com/develop. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and you'll be able to keep up with all of our podcast episodes and tutorials as they come out. And last but not least, don't stop learning, stay on track, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.